Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome and thank you for being with us today. I'm Peggy Sattler, MPP for London West, and also NDP Critic for training colleges and universities. I'm very excited about my first press conference and the opportunity to talk to you today about the private members bill I introduced yesterday in the legislature, the Greater Protection for Interns and Vulnerable Workers Act. So before I introduce the other speakers who have joined me on this panel this morning, I wanted to acknowledge some special guests who have joined us today. Alison Williams, a former USA board member, Anna Goldfish and Kaylee Kennedy from CFS Ontario, Najiba Sardar and Sandy Hudson from U of T Student Council, and Matt Karan from the College Student Alliance will be joining us soon. Certainly their support for this legislation, their interest and willingness to come out today demonstrates how critically important this issue is to post-secondary students. So I want to welcome the people who have joined me on this panel. Each of them will be providing some brief comments on the legislation. Labor lawyer Andrew Langille, to my left, will be speaking, sharing his perspective on the bill. He's one of the few Canadian experts that we have with knowledge about issues of unpaid internships. Josh Mandrick from Students Against Unpaid Internship Scams has been organizing on this issue for years, and Alistair Woods, chair of CFS Ontario, has taken a leadership role on this issue. So I'm going to start, and I will then ask each of them to share their thoughts. But before I do that, I just wanted to recognize and thank Jonah Shine, who is not with us today, but is the former MPP for Davenport, and he did a lot of work to raise the profile of this issue and actually first introduced this legislation in the last Parliament. So some of you may be asking, why reintroduce this bill? We've heard about the government's stated commitment to crack down on unpaid internships, and we also know that they have proposed amending the Occupational Health and Safety Act to cover unpaid interns. So there are a number of reasons why we felt it was important to proceed with this private members bill. First, the government's legislation died on the order paper last session, so there won't be any changes for unpaid interns unless the legislation is reintroduced. So my bill highlights this issue as a public policy priority that has to be addressed and quickly. Second, in our opinion, neither the government's crackdown nor its proposed legislation go far enough. The enforcement of existing provisions of the Employment Standards Act was long overdue and should have been happening all along. And certainly without question, unpaid interns must have the right to refuse unpaid work. But more than simply enforcing the Act, we believe that amending the Act is necessary so that unpaid interns and students have greater protections in the workplace. And finally, recent research commissioned by the Canadian Intern Association makes the amendments proposed in this private members bill particularly relevant and timely. So what does the bill do? The bill extends some basic rights under the Employment Standards Act, such as hours of work, eating periods, leaves of absence, etc., to three groups of individuals who are currently excluded from the Act. That is, secondary school students in work experience programs, college or university students who are performing work as part of their post-secondary program, and individuals receiving training that meets 6 specific criteria. We've heard of employers who assume that if they call someone an intern, that those young people are automatically excluded from the Act without making sure that the legal criteria for a training exemption are met. So we're glad that the ministry is finally enforcing the legal criteria for unpaid internships, but it's important to keep in mind that enforcement is complaint-driven. And the Canadian Intern Association's research showed that there is little awareness among interns of their rights under the Act, and those who do understand the Act may be fearful of taking complaints forward because of fear of repercussions. So we think a much more proactive approach is needed to educate and raise awareness among both employers and interns, which is why this bill requires the ministry to publish a poster about interns' rights under the Employment Standards Act to be posted by employers in a conspicuous place in the workplace. The bill also requires employers to meet with interns before the internship begins to review with the intern the conditions of work, whether the act applies, the length of employment, the job description, and the hours of work. This should be documented in a written form and then submitted to the ministry. And this is critical because it will enable the collection of data on unpaid internships, which can then be reported annually in Ontario. This will provide much needed empirical evidence to track the incidence of unpaid internships and the kind of work that interns are performing, which was a key recommendation of the Canadian Intern Association and has long been recognized as a research gap in our understanding of internships. And finally, the bill creates a clear and transparent system to allow anonymous and third-party complaints about contraventions of the Act. And this will provide vital protections to interns who believe that they are being taken advantage of but fear repercussions if they report their employer. So many of you may know that prior to my election, I did extensive research on internships and other forms of work-integrated learning, and I'm a big supporter of these programs. I think that they can provide high-quality learning experiences for students and also strengthen local economies. But I've heard too many stories of post-secondary students who are asked to perform menial, boring tasks during their placement. They don't get any learning benefit whatsoever, and their function is to reduce employers' payroll costs. There are also too many stories about people who are desperate for work experience and believe they have no other choice but to work for free in jobs that they should be paid for doing. So if these individuals, if these students and people looking to enter the labor market are doing the work of employees, they have a right to be paid, period. Unpaid internships are ethically wrong and are also bad for the economy. They further disadvantage women in the labor market, and they widen the earnings gap since women are much more likely than men to take unpaid internships. They disadvantage those from lower income backgrounds who can't afford to work for free and therefore can be shut out of job opportunities that are available to people who can. And finally, they disadvantage youth and new Canadians who are entering the labor market for the first time because instead of getting paid entry-level positions, they're now expected to work for free. So Ontario clearly needs a better system of oversight to end the exploitation of people in illegal, unpaid internships and to give trainees and students the basic workplace protections that they deserve. So I'm now going to ask Andrew to make some comments on the legislation.
Sure, and thank you, Peggy. My name's Andrew Langille, and I'm a labor lawyer, and my graduate work at Osgoode Hall Law School focused on the regulation of the school-to-labor market transition. So I have quite an extensive background in this issue, and I also represent employers and employees on internship issues. So this is something that I deal with in my practice. The realities facing interns in Ontario are quite stark. There's any number of issues. There's pervasive wage theft that's occurring right now. Estimates put the number of illegal unpaid internships in Ontario at well over 100,000 annually. So this is a big problem, and it's a growing problem that we've seen in the wake of the financial crisis. Employers are turning to unpaid labor more and more as a means to reduce labor costs. And oftentimes, this practice is contrary to the Employment Standards Act. And that's a determination that the Ministry of Labour has found. And they have stated this in their internal documents. So this is not just my analysis, this is coming from the government as well. The next thing is these positions take advantage of young workers in some very insidious ways. recent research from the Canadian Intern Association shows that predominantly young women are affected. So what you have is a period where young workers have to work for free before they can obtain a paid position. And this has any number of detrimental impacts on demographic trends, the overall economy, and the labor market. Simply put, this issue is a growing one, and it's one that's negatively affecting Ontario's economy in ways that, frankly, we don't even understand yet, because there hasn't been enough concrete research. No governments track the number of unpaid internships, and I think some of the points in this legislation will address the tracking issue. Moreover, oftentimes unpaid interns don't understand their rights, and even employers don't understand the rules surrounding unpaid internships. So I think the requirement in this legislation of having the employer sit down with the intern and go through the criteria for an unpaid internship is important. It puts the onus on both of the parties to educate themselves about what the rules are. And I think that's an important point within the legislation. I'll take questions after about any specific points, but just to end, I want to thank Peggy and Jonah Shine for their hard work in this issue, and it's very encouraging to see this initiative.
Thank you. And Josh Mandrick.
Hi, I'm Josh Mandrick, and I'm with Students Against Unpaid Internship Scams. On behalf of our group, I would like to start off by thanking Peggy Sattler for continuing Jonah Shine's work on this issue. This bill is a meaningful first step to protecting young workers who are being misclassified as unpaid interns. It begins to address the needs of students and youth across Ontario who have called for change. This past November, Students Against Unpaid Internship Scams launched our campaign calling for immediate action on unpaid internships. Between then and when Jonah first introduced the bill in March, over 1,000 students signed petitions, many hundreds more sent letters to the Minister of Labour calling for action, and others conducted a demonstration outside of the Minister of Finance's pre-budget consultation. Now, after the election, it's time to refocus the push to stop unpaid internship scams. We have taken these actions because the current regulatory regime surrounding unpaid internships is failing young workers, and we are tired of seeing our friends and our classmates being taken advantage of. When a complaint comes with the risk of being blacklisted and losing your connections, the onus cannot be on unpaid interns filing a complaint against their employer to enforce the law. For their part, employers have proven themselves unwilling or unable to appropriately apply the law to their unpaid internship positions. The measures in this bill are practical first steps in addressing the crisis in unpaid internships in Ontario. Third-party and anonymous complaints begin to address the failings of the complaints-based system of enforcement. Written notice and posting requirements will enhance both interns and employers' knowledge of their rights and obligations. And data collection will give us a better understanding of the scope of the problem. These are positive steps, and we're hopeful that the government will work with the NDP and with Peggy to quickly pass this bill. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Josh. And finally, Alistair.
Well, thank you very much. My name is Alistair Woods, and I'm the chairperson of the Canadian Federation of Students Ontario. It's the province's oldest and largest student organization, representing over 350,000 college, graduate, and undergraduate students. And I would also like to thank Peggy and Jonah for filling a huge leadership gap on this issue by introducing this bill and reintroducing it today. Today, students do face a series of unique challenges and burdens that we must address, challenges and burdens that previous generations haven't had to deal with. Ever-increasing costs like tuition fees, rent, transportation, and groceries are compounded by some of the highest youth unemployment rates in recent memory. As a result, students are going to extreme lengths to secure work experience and the promise of stable employment. Unpaid internships are one of the most common ways young people attempt to integrate themselves into the workforce, no matter what the cost. Every year, thousands of students compete for unpaid internships that cover all sectors of the economy: media, advertising, marketing, retail, finance, and even the public sector. Some of these students work full-time hours for absolutely no compensation, replacing work that would otherwise be paid. These egregious violations are rarely addressed, since a complaints-based system of enforcing labor law discourages reporting for fear that one might be blacklisted from future employment opportunities. To add insult to injury, many of these students are funneled into unpaid work through their academic institutions and programs, being asked to pay full or partial tuition fees for the opportunity to work for free. It's an astoundingly bizarre, illogical, and exploitative system that places vulnerable students in the hands of employers looking to save a few dollars on their payroll. This bill is a tremendous step in the right direction, offering protection to unpaid interns under the Employment Standards Act and tracking unpaid internship statistics so that we can better regulate these programs and shut down egregious violators. Passing this bill and implementing its recommendations would signal to Ontario's youth and students that this Legislative Assembly is taking our concerns seriously, and it will be an uncompromising affirmation that all work has value and all work deserves to be compensated. There is nothing particularly radical about seeking payment for one's work. That we have come to accept unpaid work as an inevitable and commonplace practice is what is truly radical and truly disturbing. It is our sincere hope that this bill passes and begins a broader discussion on youth, work, and compensation to ensure that my generation is not condemned to live worse off than those that came before it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alistair. And I'd now like to open the floor to questions from media.
So you say that on one hand it's growing because of the financial crisis and it's like cheap labor, and then on the other hand you said that sometimes employers maybe don't know the rules. So is it ignorance or it's just bad faith, do you think, that why there's this growing problem?
It's both. It's definitely both. As I mentioned in my comments, sometimes employers think they can just call somebody an intern and then that automatically exempts that person from the provisions of the Employment Standards Act. The employers aren't aware of the requirements of the Act to define who constitutes an employee. But we also have employers who are more and more looking to reduce labor costs by offering opportunities for unpaid internships and promoting this as a way for a young person to gain some experience. Andrew?
Well, one example that out of my practice is I recently got a decision from the Ministry of Labour on an unpaid internship case that found the intern was being misclassified as a volunteer rather than an employee. And despite the finding, the employer was back on Craigslist the next week posting another advertisement for unpaid interns. So certainly there is the ignorance factor, and I think that's quite large. But there's also active attempts at mischief to violate the Employment Standards Act and get free labor.
You mentioned some of these unpaid internships are effectively misclassifying paid work. I mean, I've seen at least one case of somebody posting an opportunity for a busboy internship. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if what some of the other examples of these kinds of misclassifications that anybody may have seen are.
They're very broad. Security guards, all sorts of things. The 6-part test in Ontario is quite narrow. And basically, if you're doing something that resembles work, you're not going to meet that test. And I think the vast majority of unpaid internships out there do resemble work and would not meet that test.
The thing you have to realize about the 6-part test is that the jurisprudence from the Ontario Labour Relations Board sets a very high bar to meet the criteria, particularly on section or part 3 of the criteria dealing with benefit. And if there's any benefit derived on the work of the unpaid intern, that generally triggers the finding that the person is in actuality an employee. So it's quite difficult to get an intern under the 6-part test. I've dealt with it in my practice for employers, and you have to jump through a lot of hoops. It's not easy to adhere to.
And yet these unpaid internships are common because the law isn't being enforced, or
it's not being enforced. There really hasn't been much proactive enforcement. There has been some steps internally within the Ministry of Labour, and that certainly is encouraging. I think there has been a scene change in their thinking on this issue, but frankly, we have a long ways to go before this issue is put to bed.
So, what I don't understand here, Mr. Langille, you're saying the existing rules, if applied, do they work? I mean, do they prevent people from being unpaid?
Do they work? It's a hypothetical question because certainly, I think it would lead to a vast reduction in the number of illegal unpaid internships, but there hasn't been enough enforcement to really see if the law works. It's an odd law. It's based on a U.S. Supreme Court decision from the 40s. So I don't know if it really relates to the realities of the 21st century new economy.
Do you find that more and more companies, regardless of whatever that company might be or business, are taking advantage of this and not paying people? They're bringing in students, whatever, from high school, maybe, or university, whatever, and just having them do whatever they might need, and they're just not paying them, period.
Yes.
I was just going to say that this is actually very common through academic programs. There was a story recently, earlier in the year, about students in a hospitality management program who had to do an internship, were required to do an internship as part of their program. And when they did this internship, they actually replaced janitorial staff. And so not only were they not getting the hospitality management training that they were being promised as part of this internship, but they were replacing the paid work of other people. And so this is very common through academic programs where it's required that you need to take on some kind of work experience or an internship to get your degree or your diploma, that many employers will accept a student, but will have them replace work that they would have otherwise paid someone to do.
So also outside of academic programs, it's equally prevalent.
When I graduated from undergrad, that was 10 years ago, it was uncommon for somebody to do an internship. Now it's commonplace. People do 2, 3, 4. I know of people who have done 10. There has been a marked uptick in the use of unpaid labor in Ontario over the past decade.
Have you seen it in your business or in your article? I mean, are you finding that people are articling and not being paid at all?
Go ask Chris Bentley. He's setting up a program where it's going to have hundreds of law grads working for free in the law practice program set up by the Law Society of Upper Canada at Ryerson. There's in law, there's been a growing problem with articling, and they had to set up an alternative program for people to get licensed.
The new alternative, which my cohort will be the first of, is essentially class time plus a placement, which will most likely be unpaid as an alternative to articling. So you're going to see in the next 3 years, during the 3-year trial period, you're going to see a lot of an incredible number of law graduates in Ontario doing unpaid placements for four-month placements.
So do we need a new law, or we need to just enforce the rules that are already in place?
Both.
Yeah, so our the approach in this private members bill is to extend the provisions, some of the basic rights under the Employment Standards Act, to trainees and to students who are involved in post-secondary work experience programs. So this is where we differ from the Liberal approach. The other big gap, and that all of us have talked about today, is that the enforcement mechanisms are complaint driven. So we need a much more proactive effort to raise both employer and intern awareness of their rights under the Act. Right now, if an intern was interested, if an employer was interested, they could go to the ministry's website and check things out and see whether they think there's a basis for a complaint. But then they still have this fear that if they lodge a complaint, that there will will be reprisal. So this legislation requires an employer who wants to bring in somebody as either a trainee or an intern to sit down with that person, to review their rights under the Employment Standards Act, and to put in writing what the job description will involve and whether the conditions for an exemption under the Act are met.
But shouldn't the bottom line be, if you're doing work, regardless of what that work is, that I think somebody said should be compensated, period. You know, forget about this unpaid training and all that. If you're doing something, you should be paid for it. I mean, isn't that what, you know, is that the kind of law you're looking for, to get away from entirely from unpaid workers?
I think that's an interesting question. I also have a private member's bill that I've been working on that looks at these kinds of programs in the post-secondary sector, and I think that the goal is to maximize paid work experiences for students, but always making sure that there is some very significant pedagogical learning benefit for the student who is doing this kind of placement as part of their academic program. It is unconscionable for students to be performing the work of paid employees as part of their post-secondary program, but I think there are times with a very clear set of expectations about what the learning opportunities should provide, when you could say that that there can be a placement that is furthering the students' educational and learning objectives.
But maybe you're still missing the mark. If you do something, you get paid for it, period.
Work is work.
Yes, I think people should be paid if they're undertaking work in all circumstances.
Yeah.
That's
work is work.
Seems to be a pretty basic thing.
Yep.
There are rules within the Employment Standards Act that prohibit the contracting out of the minimum floor of rights, and one of the parts of the minimum floor of rights is the payment of the minimum wage. So
how often would an intern file in a complaint, since it's quite common in the workforce?
I know of 13 or 14 complaints that have gone forward in relation to Section 1.2 of the Employment Standards Act, which is a 6-part test, and that would be over the span of about 12 years since the Harris government changed the law. So there's not many cases, and it's a growing problem. So that points to an issue in relation to enforcement.
They've got you over a barrel. A lot of it, that's the kid. You want experience. It's catch-22. You want experience, but if you're not being paid for that experience, and if you want to be paid, therefore you don't get the experience. I mean, isn't that basically what they're doing? Is it just
they don't want to jeopardize?
Your ransom, basically.
They don't want to jeopardize their opportunity to potentially gain actual employment with that employer, or to create this network of contacts. So they don't want to damage their own reputation and their own, their possibility for gaining employment in the future. They really do, as you say, have you over a barrel.
And we've met many students over the last year or so who have been engaged in unpaid internships and are aware of just how illegal the situation is. But as Peggy said, have said, I don't want to get blacklisted. I don't want to get a bad name in this sector. I'm just going to stick it out and hope for the best. And I think that's where the complaints-based system really has a fault in it. It discourages people from submitting a complaint because they're afraid that if they ever get caught submitting that complaint, they'll never get a job in their program or in their area of study or what they want to do, because their name will have been blacklisted as that person who submitted a complaint against that company.
And it goes, it's a bit worse than that, because in the context of academic internships, often the employer and the university or college will hold somebody graduating over their head and say, if you don't finish this internship, you don't graduate. I've had people contact me in relation to situations like that, and that's insidious and disgusting.
If I just may add, we have a lot of students and youth in our group who have been going through this experience, and they feel powerless. And at the end of the day, this is a failure in public policy. This is something that you can't put on individuals to file a complaint, because as all of the folks at this table have said, you get blacklisted, you lose your reference letter. The whole purpose of why you're doing that unpaid internship was to get in with that company in that industry. And so individuals are powerless in the situation, and that's why public policy needs to step in here.
And the other thing that several of us have talked about is there's significant equity issues at stake as well. When only people who can rely on families' financial support are able to do these unpaid internships. And the research that was done by the Canadian Intern Association showed the significant psychological stress that is created among students who have to really compromise themselves financially to do these unpaid internships if they don't have affluent families to get that kind of support. So we're creating a new generation of workers who are going to start out their careers having all of this the mental health pressures that go along with having to go from unpaid internship to unpaid internship, and also the feelings of the questions around self-worth and value when their labor market contribution isn't recognized.
What kind of discussions did you have with the government? What kind of dialogue or openness did you have with the government?
This private members bill was just introduced yesterday, so I haven't had an opportunity to discuss with the minister at this point.
Anybody speaks French? No?
That would be no.
Anna,
Yeah.
just so you know, Anna does as well from our organization. So, yeah.
Any further questions?
No, completely as an aside, I got turned down for a job in 1970 as a reporter because I wouldn't shave my mustache off.
That's unconscionable.
Thank you.
Thank you.